I'm James Carter, 63 years old, and this is the story of how my self-defense expert son-in-law learned that calling a retired Green Beret an Army Combatives master instructor old and slow is the kind of mistake that gets you submitted in 45 seconds, choked unconscious in 30 seconds, and crying to quit in front of 1,000 witnesses during a sparring match you demanded. Especially when that Green Beret spent 25 years teaching close quarters combat to Special Forces soldiers and has more real fighting experience in 3 combat deployments than any martial arts instructor will ever face in a lifetime of controlled training environments. 12 weeks after we buried my daughter Jennifer, my son-in-law Brandon Matthews posted a video on his YouTube channel demonstrating what he called advanced tactical self-defense techniques against multiple attackers. The video showed Brandon moving fluidly through choreographed scenarios where training partners attacked him with rehearsed movements, and Brandon countered with impressive-looking techniques. His narration emphasized that traditional martial arts and military hand-to-hand combat training were obsolete compared to his modern tactical self-defense system that incorporated real-world combat psychology and biomechanics. The video got 23 million views and established Brandon as a leading authority on practical self-defense. His comment section filled with praise from his 2.8 million subscribers who viewed him as someone who truly understood street fighting and real violence, unlike traditional martial artists or military instructors who taught outdated techniques in controlled environments. Brandon responded to comments by positioning himself as representing evolved combat knowledge that made older approaches, including military combatives, look primitive by comparison. Brandon's content consistently emphasized that his undefeated combat record and years of tactical training made him uniquely qualified to teach real self-defense. He'd reference his supposed extensive fighting experience and claimed that military combat training was designed for different contexts and didn't translate to civilian self-defense situations. He positioned military hand-to-hand combat as being basic techniques taught to mass numbers of soldiers rather than the sophisticated tactical systems that real experts like himself had developed through actual combat experience. I watched Brandon's advanced tactical self-defense video from my home gym in North Carolina, the same gym where I'd maintained the combat training regimen I'd used for 25 years as a Green Beret and Army Combatives instructor. I watched with the trained eye of someone who'd taught close quarters combat to Special Forces soldiers, someone who'd used those techniques in actual combat situations in 3 deployments, and someone who could immediately recognize the difference between choreographed demonstrations and techniques that would work against actual resistance. Before I tell you how Brandon learned that Green Beret hand-to-hand combat training creates capabilities that self-defense instructors can't match even when they're 40 years younger, I need you to do something. If this story resonates with you, if you've been dismissed as past your prime by someone who confused gym demonstrations with real fighting capability, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next will show you why military close quarters combat training from actual deployments exceeds anything taught in civilian martial arts studios. And leave a comment telling me about a time someone underestimated your combat training because of your age. Your stories matter, and I read every single one. Brandon Matthews had married my daughter Jennifer 8 years ago when he was 25 and she was 27. He'd been a martial arts instructor at a commercial karate school, reasonably skilled in sport karate and enthusiastic about teaching. Jennifer had been a social worker, compassionate and practical, but she'd been attracted to Brandon's confidence and his passion for martial arts. Their marriage had seemed solid for the first few years while both built their careers and lived modestly. Then 5 years ago, Brandon had discovered self-defense content creation, and his trajectory changed dramatically. He'd started filming self-defense tutorials and posting them on YouTube, initially showing basic techniques from his karate background. But as he learned what generated views and revenue, his content evolved to emphasize more dramatic and supposedly advanced tactical techniques. He started positioning himself as a combat expert rather than just a martial arts instructor, claiming extensive street fighting experience and real-world violence expertise. Brandon's breakthrough came when he posted a series called Undefeated, documenting his supposed perfect record in various martial arts competitions and challenge matches. The series showed Brandon winning tournaments and defeating challengers, all edited to emphasize his dominance and fighting prowess. The production was compelling and the series went viral, growing his subscriber base from 100,000 to over 2 million in less than a year. Brandon had transformed from a karate instructor into a self-defense celebrity. The monetization followed his viral success. Brandon opened 5 martial arts schools across North Carolina, teaching his tactical defense system. He sold online courses for $1,897, promising to teach his advanced combat techniques. He secured sponsorships from martial arts equipment companies and self-defense product manufacturers. He was invited to teach seminars at martial arts expos and law enforcement training events. His income from self-defense instruction and content creation exceeded $50,000 monthly. The lifestyle followed the income. Brandon and Jennifer upgraded to an expensive home in an upscale neighborhood. Brandon bought luxury cars, wore designer athletic wear, and projected an image of success and dominance. He attended martial arts events as a featured instructor, networking with other combat sports personalities and equipment manufacturers. He'd completely immersed himself in tactical self-defense culture and had built his identity around being an undefeated combat expert. Jennifer had been proud of Brandon's success initially, but had grown increasingly concerned over the past 2 years before she died. She'd mentioned to me that Brandon's personality had become more aggressive and his ego had grown disproportionate to his actual capabilities. She'd noticed that he avoided sparring with anyone who might actually challenge him, preferring to demonstrate techniques on compliant training partners. She'd questioned whether his undefeated record was as impressive as he claimed, noting that most of his competition wins were in small regional tournaments with limited serious competitors. Jennifer had shared specific concerns 8 months before she died in that accident. A drunk driver, senseless and tragic. She'd said Brandon had gotten into a confrontation at a bar and had backed down quickly despite always claiming he was prepared for street violence. She'd said his teaching methods at his schools emphasized flashy techniques over practical fundamentals. She'd worried that students were learning a false sense of security from techniques that wouldn't work against actual resistance. She'd been planning to discuss these concerns with Brandon directly. Then the accident happened, and she was gone before she could confront him. After Jennifer's death, Brandon had become increasingly arrogant and dismissive toward me and my military background. He'd make comments about how military hand-to-hand combat was designed for battlefield scenarios with weapons and armor, not for real civilian self-defense situations. He'd suggest that military combatives training was basic-level instruction taught to masses of soldiers rather than sophisticated tactical systems. He'd imply that my 25 years as a Green Beret and combatives instructor had taught me outdated techniques that wouldn't work in actual street confrontations. The provocations escalated over months. Brandon would visit for necessary family gatherings and demonstrate techniques, always emphasizing how much more advanced and practical they were compared to military training. He'd tell stories about his competition victories and challenge matches, positioning them as proof of superior fighting ability. He'd talk about the difference between military combat, which assumed weapons and team tactics, versus civilian self-defense, which required individual, unarmed fighting mastery, like he'd developed. Then Brandon posted a video that made my decision to confront him inevitable. The video was titled Military Combat Training versus Real Self-Defense and showed Brandon critiquing military hand-to-hand combat techniques. He demonstrated Army combatives moves and explained why they were impractical for civilian self-defense, claiming they relied too much on strength and aggression rather than technique and leverage. He specifically said that older military veterans who'd learned these outdated techniques decades ago were particularly vulnerable in actual confrontations because their methods didn't work and their physical capabilities had declined. The video got 30 million views and thousands of comments from Brandon's followers agreeing that military combat training was primitive compared to sophisticated tactical self-defense systems. Several comments specifically mocked older veterans as being slow and weak with outdated fighting knowledge. Brandon responded to these comments enthusiastically, positioning himself as representing modern combat expertise that had evolved beyond what the military taught. I watched that video in my home gym, standing in front of training equipment I'd used for decades to maintain the combat capabilities I'd developed during 25 years in Special Forces. Brandon thought I was an old and slow veteran whose military training had been basic and outdated. What he didn't understand was that Green Beret close-quarters combat training wasn't theory taught in classrooms. It was intensive practical fighting instruction designed to keep soldiers alive in hand-to-hand combat situations where losing meant death. Here's what Brandon didn't know about my actual background and capabilities. Brandon didn't know that Green Berets weren't just regular soldiers with basic hand-to-hand training. Special Forces selection and training included extensive close-quarters combat instruction that was far more demanding than anything taught in civilian martial arts schools. We'd trained in multiple fighting systems: boxing, wrestling, judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, Filipino martial arts, taking practical techniques from each and pressure testing them in full resistance, sparring with other Special Forces soldiers. Brandon didn't know that Army Combatives Master Instructors weren't just people who'd completed a basic certification course. Master Instructor selection required demonstrated excellence in hand-to-hand combat, extensive teaching experience, and the ability to defeat other highly trained fighters consistently. I'd been selected as a Master Instructor specifically because my combat skills exceeded normal Special Forces standards. I'd competed in military combatives tournaments at the highest levels and had trained hundreds of Special Forces soldiers in close-quarters combat. Brandon didn't know that during my 3 combat deployments, I'd been in situations where hand-to-hand combat wasn't demonstration or sport, but actual life-or-death fighting. I'd fought in close quarters where firearms couldn't be used, where the enemy was trying to kill me, and where technique and composure under pressure meant survival. Those experiences created a level of combat reality that no amount of tournament wins or gym demonstrations could replicate. Brandon didn't know that military combatives training was specifically designed to work under the worst possible conditions, when you were exhausted, injured, fighting multiple opponents, on unstable terrain, wearing equipment, and facing someone trying to kill you rather than score points. The techniques were simple and brutal because they had to work when everything else had gone wrong. Flashy, complex techniques that looked impressive in demonstrations were deliberately excluded because they failed under stress. Brandon didn't know that at 63 years old, I still trained regularly using the same combatives program I'd taught for 25 years. I sparred weekly with active-duty soldiers at Fort Bragg who were decades younger. I maintained conditioning specifically for fighting, strength, explosive power, cardiovascular capacity for sustained grappling. Age had reduced my absolute physical capabilities somewhat, but I'd compensated with refined technique, better timing, and the calm composure that came from actual combat experience. Most importantly, Brandon didn't know that I'd been analyzing his self-defense content with the trained eye of someone who'd seen thousands of students at every skill level and could immediately recognize the difference between genuine fighting ability and performance for cameras. Brandon's techniques looked impressive in choreographed demonstrations, but showed fundamental flaws that any combatives instructor would identify instantly. His striking technique showed poor, fundamental mechanics, improper hip rotation, telegraphed movements, inadequate follow-through. His grappling demonstrations relied on training partners, offering minimal resistance, and moving into positions that made his techniques look effective. His defense against weapons showed tactics that would get someone killed against an actual armed attacker. Everything was optimized for looking good rather than working against real resistance. I'd also noticed that Brandon's supposed undefeated competition record was misleading. When I researched the tournaments he'd won, most were small regional point karate events with limited serious competitors. His challenge match victories shown in his undefeated series were against students or lower-level martial artists, never against accomplished fighters. He'd carefully curated his competition history to create an image of fighting dominance while avoiding any real tests against elite opponents. The final provocation came when Brandon announced he was hosting a major event called the Tactical Defense Challenge. The event would feature Brandon demonstrating his techniques and inviting martial artists and combat instructors to spar with him to test their skills against his tactical system. He promoted it as an opportunity to prove whose fighting methods were superior in actual sparring rather than theoretical debate. He specifically challenged military combatives instructors to participate and prove whether military training could match sophisticated civilian tactical systems. Brandon posted promotional content mocking military combatives as being slow and predictable. He said military training created fighters who relied on strength and aggression because they lacked technical sophistication. He said older military veterans were particularly easy opponents because their outdated techniques combined with age-related decline made them vulnerable. He invited any military instructors to attend his event and discover whether their training was adequate against modern tactical fighting. I contacted Brandon directly and told him I'd participate in his tactical defense challenge. I said I was a 63-year-old retired Green Beret and Army Combatives Master Instructor, and I'd be interested in sparring with him to test whether his tactical defense system worked against someone with military close-quarters combat training. Brandon immediately accepted, posting about it on social media and positioning it as an opportunity to demonstrate that his fighting ability exceeded what military training produced even at higher skill levels. What Brandon didn't understand was that this wasn't going to be a choreographed demonstration where he controlled the action and his training partner cooperated. This was going to be actual sparring where I'd apply full resistance using techniques refined through 25 years of training elite soldiers and testing them in actual combat. And it was going to expose that Brandon's self-defense expertise was demonstrations and point karate tournaments while his ability to fight against real resistance was minimal. The old and slow veteran was about to teach the undefeated tactical defense expert what actual combat capability looked like. And Brandon was going to learn it in front of 1,000 witnesses. The morning after I accepted Brandon's sparring challenge, I began preparing for what would be a comprehensive demonstration of the difference between genuine combat capability and self-defense performance art. The Tactical Defense Challenge event was scheduled for 6 weeks later at a large martial arts expo in Charlotte with expected attendance of over 1,000 spectators plus live streaming to Brandon's 2.8 million social media followers. Brandon had positioned the event as his opportunity to prove his tactical defense system's superiority over traditional martial arts and military combatives training. I spent those 6 weeks preparing methodically using the same approach I'd used throughout my military career when training for competitions or deployments. The goal wasn't just to win the sparring match. I was confident my skills and experience exceeded Brandon's despite the age gap. The goal was to demonstrate so decisively that there would be no question about the difference between real combat training and social media self-defense expertise, while doing so in a way that would be educational rather than just destructive. I started by analyzing Brandon's fighting style through his extensive video content. I watched hundreds of his demonstration videos, competition footage, and sparring clips with the analytical approach I'd used for 25 years evaluating students and preparing for opponents. I made detailed notes about his tendencies, his favorite techniques, his physical attributes, and most importantly, his fundamental weaknesses that any trained fighter would exploit. Brandon's striking showed several consistent flaws that reflected his point karate background rather than practical combat training. His stance was too narrow and upright, optimized for bouncing and rapid directional changes in sport karate rather than for stability against real power strikes. His punches came from his arms rather than his hips, generating speed for point scoring, but lacking the structural power that would damage a resisting opponent. His kicks were flashy and high, impressive visually, but impractical against anyone who knew how to check low kicks or close distance for clinching. His grappling ability appeared minimal based on the limited footage where he actually engaged in wrestling or ground fighting. Brandon's demonstrations showed him defending against obvious attacks from cooperative partners, but never showed him actually grappling against resistance. The few competition videos that included grappling exchanges showed Brandon being taken down easily and scrambling desperately rather than demonstrating technical ground fighting. This suggested his grappling skills were his major weakness, probably because point karate didn't emphasize wrestling or groundwork. Brandon's physical attributes were reasonable for a 33-year-old martial arts instructor. He had decent speed, adequate flexibility, and the conditioning to perform demonstrations and teach classes. But nothing in his videos suggested exceptional attributes that would compensate for technical deficiencies against a skilled opponent. He wasn't particularly strong. His cardio appeared adequate, but not elite, and his explosiveness was good, but not remarkable. He was a fit martial arts instructor, but not a serious athlete. Most significantly, Brandon's videos never showed him dealing with adversity in fighting situations. He never showed footage of himself being dominated or struggling against superior opponents. His demonstrations were always successful. His competitions were carefully selected matches he won, and his training content showed him controlling partners. This pattern suggested Brandon had limited experience fighting from defensive positions or dealing with opponents who could pressure him. He developed his skills in environments where he controlled the action and avoided real tests against elite fighters. While analyzing Brandon's weaknesses, I maintained my own training regimen and specifically prepared for the sparring match. At 63 years old, I couldn't rely on the pure physical attributes I'd had at 30 or 40. But I could maximize technical efficiency, tactical intelligence, and the psychological composure that came from decades of experience. I designed my preparation to emphasize the advantages I held: superior grappling skills, better fight IQ, calm under pressure, and the ability to end fights quickly through submissions rather than relying on striking exchanges where youth and speed mattered more. I spent hours drilling takedowns and takedown defense with training partners at Fort Bragg. I worked specific grappling positions and submissions that I planned to use against Brandon, techniques that were high percentage against less skilled grapplers, and that would work despite any strength or speed advantages he might have. I practiced transitioning smoothly from striking range to clinching to takedowns, the progression that would allow me to impose a grappling fight where my technical superiority would be overwhelming. I also maintained my striking skills through pad work and light sparring, but I wasn't planning to stand and trade punches with someone 30 years younger. That would be ego-driven stupidity rather than intelligent fighting. My strategy was simple: weather any initial striking exchanges, close distance quickly, take Brandon down, advance to dominant positions, and submit him using techniques he wouldn't be able to defend. The fight would be over in under a minute if I executed properly. I prepared mentally using techniques I'd learned during Special Forces training and refined through actual combat experience. Visualization of the fight, planning for multiple scenarios, managing adrenaline and emotion, maintaining focus under pressure. Mental preparation was as important as physical training, especially for someone my age fighting against a younger opponent in front of a large crowd. I needed to be completely calm and execute my game plan regardless of what happened. 4 weeks before the event, Brandon posted a training video preparing for our sparring match. He showed himself practicing defense against takedowns and working ground positions, obviously recognizing that grappling might be a factor against someone with my background. But his training showed fundamental misunderstandings about defensive grappling. He was practicing techniques in isolation without real pressure. His training partners weren't providing realistic resistance, and his movements suggested he'd learned grappling recently rather than having years of experience. Someone who'd actually trained Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or wrestling seriously could see immediately that Brandon's grappling was at beginner level. Brandon's video narration emphasized that he'd been preparing specifically for military combative style and had developed counters to the predictable techniques I'd use. He said military grappling was strong but basic, relying on strength and aggression rather than technical sophistication. He claimed his tactical defense system incorporated more advanced grappling concepts that would neutralize my attacks. He was setting up a narrative where his tactical expertise would overcome my military training. The comments on Brandon's video showed his followers believed his claims completely. Thousands of comments praised his preparation and predicted he'd defeat the old military veteran easily. Several comments mocked the idea that a 63-year-old could compete with Brandon in his prime regardless of military background. Brandon responded to these comments by saying he respected my service, but that modern tactical defense had evolved beyond what military training offered, especially considering the physical decline that came with age. I didn't respond on social media or post training videos. Green Berets didn't fight battles online where narrative mattered more than capability. We let performance speak for itself. Brandon could claim whatever he wanted about his preparation and his tactical superiority. The sparring match would provide objective evidence of whose skills were genuine and whose were performance art optimized for social media. 2 weeks before the event, the expo organizers contacted me to discuss the format and rules for the sparring match. They wanted to ensure safety while allowing legitimate testing of skills. I suggested modified MMA rules, striking allowed to the head and body but with control to avoid injuries, takedowns allowed, grappling on the ground allowed, submissions allowed with immediate tap recognition. This format would allow Brandon to use his striking if he could, while also allowing me to demonstrate that military combatives grappling was effective regardless of his preparation. Brandon agreed to these rules, apparently confident his tactical defense system would work under any format. The organizers also asked about the duration structure. I suggested 3 3-minute rounds with 1-minute rest periods, matching standard MMA format. This would give Brandon every opportunity to demonstrate his skills and endurance. If the fight ended quickly through submission, that would be decisive evidence of the skill gap. If it went the full 9 minutes, endurance and conditioning would become factors. Brandon agreed, probably expecting I'd fatigue quickly given my age. 1 week before the event, I received a message from a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt who taught at one of Brandon's schools. He said he'd been hired 6 months ago to teach grappling classes because Brandon recognized his schools needed ground fighting instruction to be complete martial arts programs. He said Brandon had very limited grappling experience, maybe 6 months of casual training total. He said Brandon had been taking private lessons recently to prepare for our match, but was still at white belt level in actual grappling ability. He said he felt obligated to warn me, so I wouldn't inadvertently injure Brandon by applying advanced submissions against someone who couldn't properly defend them. I thanked him for the information and assured him I'd be careful to apply submissions with control and release immediately upon tap. The message confirmed what I'd suspected from analyzing Brandon's videos. His grappling was minimal, and his preparation over a few weeks wouldn't be adequate against someone with my background. The fight was going to be decided on the ground, where Brandon's striking skills were irrelevant and his limited grappling ability would be exposed completely. 3 days before the event, Brandon posted a final promotional video. He showed himself shadow boxing and hitting pads, demonstrating his striking speed and power. He talked about his undefeated record and his years of tactical defense training. He said that while he respected military service, combat sports and self-defense required different skills than battlefield hand-to-hand combat. He positioned the upcoming match as proof that his tactical defense system represented the pinnacle of unarmed combat effectiveness. Brandon's confidence in the video was absolute. He clearly believed he was going to defeat me, probably expecting that his youth and speed would overwhelm whatever skills I'd maintained at 63 years old. He'd convinced himself that his point karate background and recent grappling training were adequate against military combatives. He didn't understand that the gap between our actual fighting experience was enormous. He had tournament wins against limited competition, while I had combat deployments where fighting meant life or death. I spent the final 2 days before the match in quiet preparation. I reviewed my game plan one final time. Stay calm during any initial striking exchange. Close distance when I chose. Secure a takedown using Brandon's poor defensive technique against him. Advance to mount or back control. Finish with a submission that would be obvious to the audience. I visualized the sequence repeatedly until it was automatic. I also reviewed worst-case scenarios and how I'd respond if Brandon managed to land a lucky strike or if something unexpected happened. The morning of the Tactical Defense Challenge arrived with perfect weather in Charlotte. The expo was being held at a large convention center with the main stage set up for demonstrations and the sparring matches. Brandon's match with me was scheduled as the featured event in the afternoon, with expected attendance of over 1,000 spectators in person plus Brandon's social media followers watching via live stream that was projected to reach hundreds of thousands of viewers. I arrived at the venue 3 hours early to acclimate to the environment and complete my warm-up routine. The expo floor was filled with martial arts equipment vendors, various schools demonstrating their styles, and attendees watching demonstrations and competitions. Several people recognized me and asked if I was really going to spar with Brandon Matthews. I confirmed I was and deflected questions about my expectations, saying I'd let the performance speak for itself. Brandon arrived 2 hours before our scheduled match, surrounded by an entourage of students from his schools and crew filming content for his social media. He worked the crowd like a celebrity, taking photos and signing autographs, projecting absolute confidence. He wore custom fight gear with his school logos and sponsors prominently displayed. He looked like a professional fighter preparing for a major bout, playing to his audience and building the narrative of the undefeated champion defending his reputation. I warmed up quietly in a designated area away from the main expo floor. I went through my standard pre-fight routine, dynamic stretching, movement drills, light shadow boxing, specific grappling movements. I ran through the positions and submissions I planned to use, ensuring my body was prepared and my mind was focused. At 63, proper warm-up was essential to avoid injury and to ensure I could perform at my maximum capability. The expo announcer called for spectators to gather at the main stage for the featured sparring match. Over 1,000 people assembled around the matted competition area, with more watching on large screens set up throughout the venue. The live stream went active, with tens of thousands of viewers already watching. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Everyone wanted to see whether the tactical defense expert could defeat the older military veteran or whether experience would overcome youth. Brandon made his entrance to dramatic music, walking through the crowd with his entourage, pumping up the audience. He climbed onto the stage and shadow boxed, showing his speed and technique, playing to the crowd. The audience responded enthusiastically, most of them clearly his supporters who'd come specifically to watch him compete. He looked confident and dominant, exactly the image he'd cultivated through his social media content. I made my entrance without fanfare, walking calmly to the stage in plain black rash guard and shorts with no logos or sponsors. No entourage, no dramatic music, no performance. Just a 63-year-old man who'd spent 25 years training soldiers for actual combat walking to a sparring match with someone who'd spent years teaching demonstrations. The contrast between Brandon's showmanship and my quiet approach was stark. The referee brought us to center stage and reviewed the rules: striking with control, takedowns allowed, ground fighting and submissions allowed with immediate stop upon tap, 3-minute rounds. Brandon nodded confidently. I nodded calmly. The referee asked if we were ready. Brandon bounced on his toes, loose and energetic. I stood still, breathing steadily, completely composed. The referee stepped back and signaled for us to begin. Brandon immediately launched a fast combination: jab, cross, low kick. Exactly the point karate style I'd expected. The strikes were quick but lacked real power because his fundamentals were flawed. I checked the low kick and moved laterally, weathering his initial burst. He followed with a spinning back kick, flashy and fast but telegraphed and off balance. I stepped aside and immediately changed levels, shooting a double-leg takedown before Brandon could reset his stance. Brandon's takedown defense was exactly as inadequate as I'd anticipated. He reached down with his hands rather than sprawling, a fundamental error that every wrestler learned to avoid in their first week. I secured both his legs, drove forward with my shoulder, and took him to the mat easily. The crowd gasped. The undefeated tactical defense expert had been taken down in the first exchange, perhaps 10 seconds into the match. On the ground, Brandon's lack of grappling experience became immediately obvious. He tried to push me away with straight arms, creating space that actually made it easier for me to advance position. I moved smoothly to half guard, isolated his far arm, and transitioned to full mount in seconds. Brandon bridged and thrashed, white belt panic responses that accomplished nothing against proper mount control. I secured high mount with my knees tight under Brandon's arms, completely controlling his upper body. He couldn't buck me off, couldn't create space, couldn't escape. I could feel his panic increasing as he realized he was completely helpless. I established a cross-collar grip, the setup for a basic judo choke. Brandon tried to defend by grabbing my arms, but his defensive technique was poor and his grips were weak from exhaustion and panic. I completed the cross-collar choke, pulling one collar deep across his neck and using the other hand to tighten the pressure. Brandon's eyes went wide as the choke compressed his carotid arteries. He tapped frantically, 3 sharp taps on my arm, the universal submission signal. I released immediately and stood up. The referee checked Brandon, who nodded that he was okay, though clearly shaken. The clock showed 45 seconds had elapsed. The undefeated tactical defense expert had just been submitted by a 63-year-old military veteran in 45 seconds. In front of 1,000 live spectators and hundreds of thousands watching on live stream. The old and slow veteran had just destroyed his prime-age opponent using basic military combatives technique. And we still had 2 more rounds to go. The audience sat in stunned silence after I submitted Brandon in 45 seconds of the first round. The confident tactical defense expert who'd promised to demonstrate the superiority of his system over military training was sitting on the mat looking shocked and humiliated, having just been completely dominated by the 63-year-old Green Beret he'd called old and slow. The referee gave us the mandatory 1-minute rest period before round 2. Though Brandon clearly needed more time to recover both physically and psychologically from what had just happened. Brandon stood slowly and walked to his corner where his entourage tried to encourage him. His students were telling him it was just one round, that he could adjust his strategy, that he'd catch me with striking in the next round. But I could see Brandon's body language had completely changed from his confident entrance. His shoulders were slumped, his movements tentative, his eyes showing the dawning realization that he was completely outmatched. 45 seconds of actual grappling had exposed the enormous gap between his social media expertise and real fighting capability. I stood calmly in my corner, breathing steadily, showing no fatigue despite just completing a grappling exchange. 45 seconds was nothing for someone who'd trained full resistance sparring for decades. I'd barely elevated my heart rate. Brandon, meanwhile, was breathing hard, his face flushed, his body showing the panic exhaustion that came from being controlled and submitted by someone whose skill level exceeded yours completely. The physical contrast was obvious to everyone watching. The referee called us back to center for round 2. Brandon approached more cautiously this time, no longer bouncing and loose, but moving carefully like someone who'd just learned his opponent was dangerous. I maintained the same calm demeanor, ready to execute the same strategy, whether any striking, close distance, take him down, submit him. Brandon had no answer for this approach in round 1, and nothing had changed in the 1-minute rest that would make him able to defend it now. Brandon attempted to maintain distance with long-range kicks, trying to use his reach and keep me away from clinching range. He threw a few jabs and low kicks, all controlled and tentative compared to his aggressive opening in round 1. I could see he was terrified of being taken down again, his stance wider and lower than before, his weight back on his heels. This defensive posture made him even more vulnerable because he couldn't generate power from this position and couldn't move quickly to escape if I closed distance. I feinted a level change, just dipping my shoulders slightly as if shooting for a takedown. Brandon reacted immediately and excessively, sprawling hard and dropping his hands to defend the takedown that wasn't actually coming. This was exactly the reaction I wanted. Brandon was now so concerned about my takedowns that he'd panic at the threat, creating openings in his defenses. I stepped forward as he sprawled, secured an overhook and underhook, and pulled him into a clinch. In the clinch, Brandon tried to create separation by pushing against my chest, another fundamental error that anyone with real clinch experience would never make. Pushing with straight arms just extended his arms and created space for me to move my hips, which I did immediately. I rotated my hips, dropped my level slightly, and executed a simple outside trip, one of the most basic takedowns in judo and wrestling. Brandon went down hard, landing flat on his back with me already advancing to side control. Brandon's panic was now obvious. He was thrashing randomly rather than using technical escapes, burning energy without accomplishing anything productive. I maintained heavy side control, using my body weight and proper positioning to make Brandon carry my weight while restricting his movement. Every time he tried to bridge or turn, I countered smoothly, shutting down his attempts before they could develop. This was fundamental grappling control that I taught thousands of times, using position and pressure to dominate an opponent. I slid my knee across Brandon's stomach and moved to mount position for the second time in 2 rounds. Brandon tried the same ineffective defenses he'd used in round 1, bridging with poor technique, pushing against me with straight arms, thrashing without purpose. None of it worked against proper mount control. I settled into high mount again, completely controlling his upper body, and began working for my next submission. This time I chose a different finish to demonstrate multiple submission skills. I trapped Brandon's right arm by overhooking it with my left arm, then slid my right arm under his neck and gripped my own left bicep, the setup for an arm triangle choke. Brandon didn't recognize the submission setup because his grappling knowledge was too limited. He continued trying to push me away with his free left arm, not understanding that he was already caught in a submission position. I dropped my weight onto Brandon's trapped arm and neck, closing the triangle of compression that cut off blood flow to his brain. I squeezed my arms together and drove my shoulder into the side of his neck, completing the choke. Brandon's eyes went wide again as he felt the pressure. He tried to roll, but couldn't move with my weight controlling him. He tried to grab my arms, but couldn't break the grip. After a few seconds of futile struggling, he tapped frantically again, multiple rapid taps on my arm signaling submission. I released immediately and stood. The referee checked Brandon, who nodded he was okay, but looked even more devastated than after the first submission. The clock showed 30 seconds had elapsed in round 2. I'd submitted the undefeated tactical defense expert twice in under 90 seconds of total fighting time across 2 rounds. The demonstration of the skill gap was becoming undeniable. Brandon's tactical defense system had no answer for basic military combatives grappling. The 1-minute rest before round 3 felt longer. Brandon sat in his corner, looking completely broken. His entourage was trying to motivate him, but their words seemed hollow. Everyone in the venue could see that Brandon was being dominated completely. His students watching from the audience were silent, no longer cheering enthusiastically like they had before the match started. The live stream chat was exploding with shock and mockery. Brandon's own followers were turning on him as they watched their instructor being submitted repeatedly by a man 30 years older. I stood calmly in my corner, showing no signs of fatigue or stress. 2 submission finishes in under 90 seconds of work was well within my comfortable capacity. I could fight at this intensity for much longer if necessary. Brandon, meanwhile, was exhausted both physically from the panic of being controlled and psychologically from the humiliation of being dominated so easily in front of his largest audience ever. The referee called us to center for round 3. Brandon approached even more tentatively than round 2, his body language showing complete demoralization. He threw a few half-hearted jabs with no commitment, going through the motions of striking but clearly just trying to survive until the end of the round. His supposed tactical defense system had been exposed as completely inadequate against real fighting skills. I decided to change my approach for round 3. I demonstrated that I could take Brandon down and submit him at will from grappling positions. Now I wanted to show that military combative striking was also effective despite Brandon's claims that military training was only grappling focused and didn't develop sophisticated striking. I stayed at kicking range and began working behind a jab, controlling distance and limiting Brandon's offensive options. My jab landed cleanly several times, straight punches that came from my hip with proper rotation. Nothing fancy, but mechanically sound with real power behind them. Brandon's defense was poor, his hands dropping and his reactions slow from exhaustion and demoralization. Each jab snapped his head back and made him retreat. I wasn't trying to knock him out or damage him seriously, just demonstrating that my striking fundamentals were sound and that Brandon's defensive technique was inadequate even in his supposed specialty of striking. Brandon tried to respond with his own combinations, but everything was tentative and poorly executed. His punches came from his arms without hip rotation, his kicks lacked balance and power, his footwork was sloppy. The crisp technical striking he'd shown in his demonstration videos was nowhere to be seen under actual pressure. He was fighting like someone who'd learned techniques in controlled environments, but had never developed the ability to apply them against real resistance. I threw a low kick to Brandon's lead leg, a basic Muay Thai round kick that checked his forward movement and hurt his thigh. Brandon winced and tried to check the next one, but his checking technique was poor and the kick landed anyway. I threw another low kick, this one harder, and Brandon's leg buckled slightly. He was accumulating damage now, his mobility decreasing, his options narrowing even further. Then Brandon did something that surprised me and probably shocked everyone watching. He simply stopped fighting. He stood there with his hands down, looked at the referee, and said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I can't do this anymore. I quit." His voice broke slightly as he said it, the psychological defeat complete. The undefeated tactical defense expert was literally quitting in the middle of round 3, unable to continue against the 63-year-old military veteran who'd submitted him twice and was now beating him in striking exchanges. The referee immediately stopped the match and raised my hand in victory. The audience reaction was mixed. Some applauded respectfully, recognizing they'd witnessed a definitive demonstration of real fighting capability. Others sat in shocked silence, processing what they'd just seen. Brandon's students and supporters looked devastated. Their instructor had been completely dominated and had quit rather than finish the match. The live stream viewer count had swelled to over 300,000 people who'd watched Brandon's humiliation in real time. Brandon walked off the stage quickly, his head down, his entourage following uncertainly. He'd entered the venue like a champion and was leaving like someone who'd just had their entire identity shattered. The confident self-defense expert who'd mocked military training had been submitted twice and had quit against a man 30 years older using exactly the military combatives techniques Brandon had called outdated and ineffective. I remained on stage as the referee continued holding my hand raised in victory. I wasn't celebrating or gloating, just standing calmly as I had throughout the entire match. This hadn't been about ego or revenge. This had been about demonstrating truth, that real combat training from actual deployments creates capabilities that social media self-defense expertise can never match. That military combatives works against resistance despite being simple and fundamental. That experience and technical skill overcome youth and speed when the skill gap is large enough. The announcer asked if I wanted to say anything to the audience. I took the microphone and spoke directly to the 1,000 people in attendance and the hundreds of thousands watching the live stream. I explained that I hadn't done this match to humiliate Brandon personally, but to demonstrate an important truth about self-defense training. Social media was filled with instructors who had impressive demonstrations and large followings, but whose actual fighting capabilities were minimal. Students deserved to learn from people with legitimate credentials and real experience, not from performers who'd optimized their content for views rather than effectiveness. I explained that military combatives training wasn't outdated or ineffective as Brandon had claimed. It was specifically designed to work under the worst possible conditions against opponents trying to kill you, which meant it absolutely worked in controlled sparring matches or civilian self-defense scenarios. The techniques were simple and fundamental because complexity failed under stress. The training emphasized full resistance pressure testing because techniques that only worked with cooperative partners were useless in real confrontations. I also addressed Brandon's claims about being old and slow, making military veterans vulnerable in fights. I explained that while age did reduce physical attributes, technical skill and experience compensated significantly. Proper technique was more efficient than athleticism. Better timing meant you didn't need as much speed. Superior positioning meant you didn't need as much strength. Experience managing adrenaline and staying calm under pressure was more valuable than youthful energy. I'd just demonstrated all of this by dominating someone 30 years younger using fundamental skills I'd maintained for decades. I finished by encouraging everyone watching to be skeptical of self-defense instructors who had impressive social media followings but questionable credentials. Ask about their actual fighting experience against trained opponents. Ask whether they regularly spar with full resistance against people who aren't their students. Ask whether they've trained with legitimate combat sports or military instructors. Real self-defense training should make you capable, not just confident. Brandon had been very confident based on his demonstrations and tournament wins, but when tested against someone with real combat training, his capabilities proved minimal. The audience applauded as I handed the microphone back and left the stage. Several military veterans in attendance came up to thank me for defending the reputation of military combatives training. One older Marine said he'd been insulted by Brandon's videos claiming military training was outdated, and seeing me submit Brandon twice had validated what he'd learned during his service. Several active duty soldiers who'd been in the audience said they'd be sharing the video with their units to show why they should take combatives training seriously. Over the next several hours as the expo continued, dozens of people approached me with questions about military combatives training, special forces selection, and how to evaluate self-defense instruction quality. Many were Brandon's former students who were now questioning what they'd learned at his schools and whether they should find instruction elsewhere. I spent time explaining what to look for in legitimate training: full resistance sparring, pressure testing techniques, instructors with verifiable credentials from recognized organizations, training environments that emphasized practical application over demonstrations. The video of the match went viral within hours. Multiple people had recorded it and posted to social media platforms. By that evening, the combined videos had been viewed over 20 million times. Brandon Matthews' name was trending on multiple platforms, but now as an example of fake self-defense expertise rather than as tactical defense authority. Every claim he'd made about his undefeated record and superior fighting system was being mocked in comment sections. His followers were abandoning him in massive numbers. The martial arts community's response was particularly harsh. Legitimate fighters and instructors who'd always been skeptical of Brandon's claims were now openly criticizing him for having fraudulent credentials and for teaching students techniques that didn't work. Several MMA fighters and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts posted reaction videos explaining the technical failures they'd observed in Brandon's performance. The consensus was clear. Brandon had been exposed as someone who looked impressive in demonstrations but couldn't fight at even basic levels against real resistance. Brandon's business suffered immediate consequences. His 5 martial arts schools saw massive drops in attendance as students canceled memberships. His online course sales stopped completely as potential buyers realized his tactical defense system had been proven ineffective. Sponsors terminated relationships and demanded return of equipment and sponsorship fees. The expo organizers issued a statement saying they'd been misled about Brandon's credentials and wouldn't be inviting him to future events. Most devastating for Brandon was the loss of his social media following and credibility. His subscriber count collapsed from 2.8 million to less than 400,000 within a week as people unsubscribed or as platforms suspended accounts for violating terms about misleading content. His remaining followers were mostly people mocking him or demanding refunds for courses they'd purchased. Every video he'd posted about tactical defense expertise was now evidence of fraudulent claims rather than legitimate instruction. The old and slow veteran had systematically destroyed the undefeated tactical defense expert's career using basic military combatives in under 3 minutes of actual fighting. And hundreds of thousands of people had watched it happen live. The week following the tactical defense challenge brought comprehensive consequences for Brandon that extended far beyond the immediate humiliation of being submitted twice and quitting against a 63-year-old opponent. The viral videos of the match had been viewed over 100 million times across various platforms within 7 days, making it one of the most watched martial arts sparring matches in social media history. Brandon Matthews had become infamous as the fake self-defense expert who'd been exposed by the military veteran he'd mocked. The martial arts community conducted what amounted to a collective investigation of Brandon's credentials and claims in the days after the match. Multiple martial artists and journalists examined his supposed undefeated record and discovered it was far less impressive than he'd portrayed. Most of his tournament wins were in small regional point karate events with limited serious competition. His challenge match victories shown in his undefeated series were against lower-level students and amateur fighters, never against accomplished martial artists. He'd carefully curated his competition history to create an image of fighting dominance, while systematically avoiding any tests against elite opponents. Several of Brandon's former training partners came forward with statements about his actual skill level and training practices. A kickboxing coach who'd worked with him years ago said Brandon had been an average student with decent athletic ability, but had quit after a few months because he didn't want to spar hard with advanced fighters. A Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructor said Brandon had attended maybe 10 classes total over a year, always finding excuses to avoid rolling with upper belts. Multiple people confirmed that Brandon's extensive martial arts background was exaggerated and that his actual training history was limited to point karate and recent crash course preparation. The exposure of Brandon's fraudulent credentials triggered investigations by consumer protection agencies. He'd sold his ultimate tactical defense course for $1,897 to thousands of people while claiming credentials and fighting experience he didn't actually possess. He'd promised his system would make students capable in real self-defense situations based on his supposed elite expertise. State Attorney General offices in North Carolina and several other states opened investigations into whether Brandon's business practices constituted consumer fraud. Brandon initially tried to defend himself through social media posts, claiming that the sparring match didn't represent the full scope of his tactical defense system and that he'd been caught off guard by my grappling focus. But these explanations were immediately ridiculed by commenters who pointed out he'd been submitted twice, beaten in striking exchanges, and had literally quit. His attempts to frame the match as anything other than complete domination were unsuccessful. After a few days of hostile responses, Brandon deleted most of his social media accounts and went silent. 2 weeks after the match, Brandon posted a comprehensive confession video similar to what Kyle the survival expert had done. The video showed Brandon looking exhausted and defeated, sitting alone without his usual production quality or confident demeanor. He admitted that his tactical defense expertise had been significantly exaggerated, that his undefeated record was misleading because he'd avoided serious competition, and that his actual fighting capabilities were far below what he'd claimed in his marketing and content. Brandon specifically addressed the match with me, admitting he'd been completely outclassed and that military combatives training had proven far more effective than his tactical defense system. He acknowledged that calling me old and slow had been ignorant arrogance from someone who'd never faced a truly skilled opponent. He said that being submitted twice in under 90 seconds had been humiliating, but had forced him to confront the reality that his supposed expertise was mostly demonstrations and carefully selected low-level competitions rather than genuine fighting capability. Brandon's confession video included apologies to students who'd purchased his courses based on his fraudulent credentials. He announced he was closing his 5 martial arts schools and would be processing full refunds for everyone who'd purchased his online Ultimate Tactical Defense course. He said the refunds would total approximately $3.2 million and would bankrupt his business completely. He also announced he was leaving the martial arts instruction field permanently, recognizing that his credibility was destroyed and that he didn't have the legitimate expertise to teach self-defense. The video concluded with a specific apology to the military veteran community and to me personally. Brandon acknowledged that military combatives training represented legitimate combat expertise developed through decades of real-world application in life-or-death situations. He said his attacks on military training had been defensive projection from someone who felt insecure about having no real combat experience. He thanked me for exposing his fraud in a definitive way that would prevent him from continuing to mislead students and potentially putting people in danger by teaching ineffective techniques. Brandon's confession video was viewed over 40 million times and became a definitive case study in martial arts fraud and social media deception. Multiple martial arts organizations and legitimate instructors used it as an educational tool about the importance of verifying credentials and being skeptical of impressive demonstrations without pressure testing. Several state martial arts licensing boards implemented new requirements for instructor certification based partly on lessons from Brandon's case. 3 weeks after the match, I was contacted by Army Recruiting Command and asked if I'd be willing to participate in content showcasing the effectiveness of Army combatives training. They said my match with Brandon had generated enormous interest in military hand-to-hand combat training and had become one of the most effective recruiting tools they'd seen in recent years. Young people who'd watched the video were asking how they could learn the combative skills that had allowed a 63-year-old to dominate a prime-age martial arts instructor. I agreed to participate and spent several months working with Army Recruiting Command on content that explained the Army Combatives program, showed proper training methodology, and highlighted how military combat training created practical self-defense capabilities. The content featured testimonials from soldiers I'd trained who'd used combative skills in actual combat situations. It explained the pressure testing methodology that made military techniques reliable under stress. It demonstrated the difference between demonstrations optimized for appearance versus techniques proven through full resistance sparring. The recruiting content featuring my story and the match with Brandon was viewed over 50 million times and contributed to measurable increases in Army enlistment interest, particularly among people interested in combat arms specialties and special forces. Multiple recruiting stations reported potential recruits specifically mentioning the Brandon Matthews sparring match as something that had influenced their decision to explore military service. The video had become an unexpected but highly effective demonstration of the practical value of military training. I also established a nonprofit foundation using proceeds from speaking engagements that followed the viral video. The foundation provided free self-defense instruction for military veterans and their families, teaching practical techniques based on Army combatives principles. It also created educational content helping people evaluate martial arts instruction quality and avoid fraudulent instructors who made claims they couldn't back up. The foundation partnered with legitimate martial arts schools to provide quality instruction to underserved communities. The foundation's work included developing guidelines for evaluating self-defense instructors and training programs. We created checklists asking important questions. Does the instructor have verifiable credentials from recognized organizations? Do they regularly spar with full resistance against trained opponents? Do they pressure test techniques rather than only demonstrating them on compliant partners? Have they competed successfully against serious competition? Can they explain why their techniques work based on human biomechanics rather than just demonstrating that they look impressive? These evaluation guidelines were adopted by several consumer protection organizations and were used to develop model legislation in multiple states requiring martial arts instructors to verify their credentials and not make misleading claims about their expertise. Brandon's case had exposed how easy it was for fraudulent instructors to operate without oversight, and the regulatory response aimed to protect consumers from similar deception in the future. 6 months after the match, I was invited to teach a seminar at Fort Bragg for active duty Special Forces soldiers about maintaining combat skills after retirement. Over 200 Green Berets attended the seminar where I discussed training methodology for lifelong capability, how to adapt techniques as physical attributes changed with age, and why technical refinement and mental composure could compensate for reduced athleticism. I also told the story of the Brandon Matthews match as an example of how proper fundamentals maintained through consistent training remained effective decades after initial instruction. The seminar included live demonstrations where I sparred with soldiers in their 20s and 30s, showing that while I couldn't match their physical attributes, technical skill and experience allowed me to compete effectively. Several of the soldiers I sparred with were accomplished grapplers with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu purple or brown belts. Yet I was able to control positions and threaten submissions using fundamental techniques refined over decades. The demonstrations reinforced the lesson that combat skills built on proper fundamentals remained valuable throughout life. 1 year after the Tactical Defense Challenge, I received a letter from Brandon. He'd completed the refund processing that had bankrupted his martial arts business and was now working as a personal trainer at a commercial gym, far removed from self-defense instruction. He wrote that the past year had been the most difficult of his life as he dealt with the destruction of his career, public humiliation, and financial ruin from refunds and legal settlements. But he said the forced accountability had been necessary because his fraudulent claims had potentially endangered students who'd learned techniques that wouldn't work in actual self-defense situations. Brandon wrote that the sparring match had been a watershed moment because it had forced him to confront the enormous gap between his social media image and his actual capabilities. He said being submitted twice in under 90 seconds by someone 30 years older had destroyed his ego, but had taught him essential truths about the difference between demonstration and capability. He said he'd spent a year learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and boxing from legitimate instructors, training as a beginner rather than as an expert, and had discovered how little he'd actually known despite years of teaching self-defense. Brandon also wrote about his understanding of why he'd attacked military combatives training. He said it had been insecurity-driven projection. He'd felt threatened by people with legitimate combat credentials and real fighting experience, so he'd attacked them to make his own fraudulent expertise seem superior. He said watching me perform techniques with calm efficiency while he panicked and failed had taught him that real combat capability came from decades of proper training and actual experience, not from social media following and carefully curated demonstrations. I wrote back acknowledging his apparent growth and understanding. I told him that recognizing fraud and accepting consequences were signs of character development that had been absent when he was creating content for revenue and ego. I said that if he'd learned that real capability required humble training with legitimate instruction rather than performing for cameras, the painful experience would ultimately prove valuable. I also told him that military combatives philosophy emphasized that warriors continuously trained regardless of rank or experience, and I hoped he'd continue developing genuine skills with that humble approach. I'm James Carter, 65 years old now. I'm a retired Green Beret and Army Combatives Master Instructor who spent 25 years teaching close quarters combat to Special Forces soldiers and who used those techniques in actual combat situations during 3 deployments. I'm a father who lost his daughter but honored her memory by exposing the fraud she'd suspected and protecting thousands of students from learning ineffective techniques from an instructor with fabricated credentials. Brandon Matthews called me old and slow and built a career on flashy demonstrations while mocking military combatives as outdated and ineffective. He claimed his tactical defense system represented evolved combat expertise that exceeded what military training produced. He convinced 2.8 million followers that his techniques were superior to traditional martial arts and military hand-to-hand combat training based on his supposed undefeated record and years of tactical experience. He learned that Green Beret close quarters combat training creates capabilities that work against actual resistance without choreography or cooperation. That 25 years of teaching soldiers to fight for their lives in combat situations produces expertise that social media demonstrations can never replicate. That real combat experience from deployments provides understanding of fighting that no amount of point karate tournaments can match. To anyone whose military combat training has been dismissed by martial arts instructors who've never faced real violence, or whose fighting capabilities have been underestimated because of age, remember this. Legitimate combat skills are proven through performance against resistance, not through demonstrations with compliant partners. Military combatives training exists because it works in actual life or death combat situations. The techniques are simple and fundamental because complexity fails under stress, not because military instructors don't understand sophisticated systems. Brandon's career collapsed because he'd built it entirely on demonstrations and carefully selected low-level competitions while avoiding any real tests against skilled opponents. When faced with actual sparring against someone with legitimate combat training, he was submitted twice in under 90 seconds and quit rather than face further humiliation. The old and slow veteran dominated the prime-age tactical defense expert using basic military techniques maintained through consistent training over decades. This is Sergeant Major Rhett James Carter, United States Army Special Forces, signing off. To my fellow Green Berets and military combatives instructors, your training matters. The techniques you learned and taught are legitimate and effective. Don't let social media martial arts culture make you doubt capabilities that were proven in actual combat. Maintain your skills, take pride in your training, and know that real fighting ability exceeds anything that's optimized for camera performance. The skills endure. The training works. And truth always defeats performance when tested under pressure. Stay dangerous, stay humble, and keep training.